Chapter 9. The Journey of Life and Death. Back to the present, Tony and Paul were sipping their drinks. After reminiscing about the events from 12 years ago, Tongue suddenly asked Paul, "Oh, I forgot to ask you. 12 years ago, you gave me something to hold in my mouth that night. What was that?" Paul took a big gulp of his drink, exhaled loudly, and said, That? You've probably heard the saying among AGARWOOD hunters. Biting roots to find AGARWOOD, haven't you? What I gave you to bite on was a special root, one that specifically repels forests, demons, and tigers. Tony, even more curious, asked, "What is it made of that makes it so effective?" Paul laughed heartily and said, "Well, I don't really know how long it's been around, but my father passed down the method to make this root to me. My father was a renowned shaman in our village, but when he got old, he passed away. As for me, I didn't feel suited to being a shaman anymore. This root comes from an ancient legend. Long ago, when people discovered AGARWOOD, they didn't call it AGARWOOD, but referred to it as the forest fairy. Why? Because when burned, it emits a gentle fragrance that no other scent could overpower. Wherever AGARWOOD appeared, there would be a tiger spirit guarding it. The tiger spirit was addicted to the scent of AGARWOOD, much like humans are to drugs. And humans were out looking for AGARWOOD. So any trespasser who approached the forest fairy was killed and eaten by the tiger. That's why, back then, people hunted AGARWOOD in groups. No matter how strong the tiger spirit was, he couldn't defeat an entire group of people. One day, someone managed to kill the tiger spirit. Among the group was a shaman. This shaman came up with the idea of creating a root that could repel fierce tigers and prevent evil spirits from entering the body. He plucked all the whiskers from the tiger spirit, including the roots of the whiskers. After bringing them home, he inserted the tiger whiskers into a growing bamboo shoot. After half a month, he split open the bamboo shoot, revealing a bunch of white worms clinging to the tiger whiskers, eating them away. The shaman cut down the entire bamboo plant and took it home. He fed the worms for another half-month until they turned from white to black. When they turned black, he fed them until they defecated. And what he needed was the excrement, produced by the worms, born from the tiger whiskers. This excrement was dried, mixed with herbs, and wrapped into a root to bite on when entering the forest. Whoever bit on this root would be protected from demons and wild animals, and the foul air of the deep forest would be warded off. That's the origin of the roots I gave you to bite on many years ago. The shaman I mentioned in the legend was my great ancestor. By my time, there were no more tiger whiskers to collect. The roots I have were left by my father. Now, I only have 5 left." Hearing Paul's explanation, Tony shivered and said, So 12 years ago, you had me bite on worm poop. Oof, and I kept it in my mouth all night." Paul chuckled and said nothing more. Tony continued, "All right, the story has been told. This time, we'll go with just 3 of us, okay? Do you still have the roots?" Paul nodded and replied, "Yes, I still have them, but they need to be recharged with a ritual. You'll have to wait for a few days. Go back first, and when it's done, I'll call you. Bring your brother up here." Saying goodbye to Paul, Tony drove home. Vin, seeing Tony back, was surprised. "Oh, you're back so soon. How did it go? When can we set off?" Tony replied, "We have to wait for my friend to call, then we'll go, brother. He has a route that saved my life many years ago. Back to 2 years ago, with Nua, the unfortunate girl whom Ken claimed was possessed by a forest spirit. Ken locked Nua in a mountain cave, giving her a potion daily that made her appear hypnotized. Every day, he would rub a yellow liquid on her skin and make her drink a concoction made from forest ginseng. 30 days passed in a flash, and Nua's skin, exposed to sunlight, was now incredibly white, even though her hair, having been in the darkness for so many days, grew even longer and silkier. Seeing Nua looking so beautiful, Ken drooled with desire, but he held back to complete his plan. That night, Ken left the village near midnight and went to where Nua was locked up. He gave her a black pill, tied a rope around her hand, and led her out of the cave. They walked one behind the other to a place with a large agarwood tree, where Ken had prepared some things beforehand. He tied Nua to the tree trunk. She didn't resist, allowing herself to be tightly bound to the tree. Ken knelt and bowed towards the base of the tree, muttering, "Oh, divine spirit, today I offer you a pure soul. May you accept it. From tomorrow, this soul will always be by your side, protecting you from those who seek to defile this place." After praying, Ken took a shiny knife, approached Nua, grabbed both her hands, and slashed deeply into her wrist veins. Fresh blood flowed down to the base of the agarwood tree and mysteriously disappeared. Ken looked at Nua and said, "Be obedient and protect the divine spirit. You hear me? It's a great honor for you." Ken left, abandoning Nua tied to the tree, slowly losing her life. He then went deeper into the forest to find the tiger. Abu, stroking the tiger's head and looking into its blood-red eyes, he said, "The food is inside. Wait until the blood stops flowing, then you can eat. Her soul has been taken by the divine spirit. You won't capture her soul this time." The tiger Abu seemed to understand Ken, letting out a low growl, enough for Ken to hear. Its eyes glowed red, staring deep into the forest. After Ken left, Nua, having lost too much blood, died. The tiger emerged from the forest, saliva dripping from its mouth with each step. It sniffed around Nua a few times, then suddenly opened its mouth and bit off her left arm, tearing it off. The tiger savored Nua's arm, chewing it in no time, and then tore off the other arm. In this way, the tiger devoured her entire body, leaving only her skull and some hair. After finishing, it snorted a few times and disappeared back into the forest. The village returned to its quiet days, with no strangers coming by. Back to the present. A week after returning from Pool House, Tony received a call from Paul, informing him that the routes were ready, and they should meet up to start the journey. That evening, Tony called his wife and son to talk. Lately, his son Tin was on school break and had returned home. As soon as they entered the room, Tony asked, "What's up, Dad? Why did you call us in?" Tony looked at them, rubbed his wife's pregnant belly, and said, "I have to go on a long journey soon. This time, I want to earn some money for our future. You're about to give birth. And after 20 years of marriage, we're finally having another child. I don't want our child to lack anything. This time, I'm going into the forest to find Argarwood with Uncle Vin and a friend. So, you three stay safe at home, okay? His wife, looking sad, said, "Please take care of yourself. If you can't find it, just come back to us. Don't go too deep into the forest. Something could happen." Before she could finish, Tony interrupted. "Come on, don't jinx it. Tin, while I'm gone, you're on school break, so help your mum out. She's pregnant, so do the heavy lifting for her, okay?" Tin nodded obediently and said to Tony, "Take care, Dad, stay safe." That night, Tony packed his things and left with Vin. Before leaving, Vin also said goodbye to his wife, Teresa. They both lit incense at the altar for their father, Tom, praying for his protection. They set off immediately, traveling through the night. By the next day, they arrived at Paul House. Paul welcomed them, gave each a route, and said, "It's been many years. I'm afraid these might not be as effective as they were back then, but they're better than nothing. Wait for me a bit. I'll grab my gear and we'll head out." Paul went inside to pack some essentials. Tony, a loose word. Chapter 10. The Escape. After Vin and his companions were captured, they were dragged back to the village and thrown into the middle of the square. Ken stood on a high platform and shouted loudly, "Everyone, come and see who we've caught." The people of Brap began to gather, surrounding Vin and his group, pointing and chattering excitedly in their native language. Ken continued, "These are the intruders who dared to trespass on our village's territory. They came here intending to steal our sacred relic. Today, I caught them. Now, tell me, what should we do with them?" The crowd below, stirred by Ken's words, shouted in unison, "Kill them. Sacrifice them to the gods, so that we may receive blessings of favorable weather and a prosperous village." Their cries echoed through the forest, awakening it with their fervor. Some villagers knelt and prayed toward the forest, invoking the gods, "Protect us from these invaders. We offer their blood and flesh to you." Once their chanting ceased, they all returned to their homes. Ken decided that it wasn't a suitable day for a sacrifice, so they left Vin and his companions tied up where they were. As night fell, the wind from the forest grew colder, causing them to shiver. Paul, more accustomed to the wilderness, fared slightly better, while Tony and Vin trembled uncontrollably, unable to move due to their restraints. Outside the village, the wind grew stronger as the night deepened. They began hearing someone singing at the edge of the forest, sometimes near, sometimes far, sometimes joyful, and other times filled with sorrow. The singing turned to screaming, and their skin crawled with fear and cold. They dreaded that whatever was making those sounds might enter the village. However, every time the singing approached the village gate, a clattering sound would emanate from the gate. This noise was made by the talisman Ken had created to ward off evil spirits. He had used a buffalo horn, filled it with herbs and charms, and carved strange symbols onto it before hanging it at the village gate. He hung 3 horns there. Whenever any evil spirits or unclean things tried to enter the village, the horns would clash against each other, creating the clattering noise. Vin struggled to move closer to Tony, so they could lean against each other for warmth. After much effort, Vin finally managed to roll over to Tony, who suddenly had an idea. "Brother, roll so your hands are closer to my mouth. I'll try to bite the ropes loose. Hurry." Without hesitation, Vin painfully maneuvered his hands behind his back, closer to Tony's mouth. The rope they used was made from woven tree bark. Not thick, but tough and tightly knotted. Vin managed to get his hands close to Tony's mouth, but despite his best efforts, the rope remained unscathed. Both brothers were drenched in sweat from the exertion, but Tony refused to give up. His only thought was to escape and return safely to his wife and children. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, but finally, Tony managed to bite through the rope, one strand at a time. With his hands free, Vin quickly untied his legs and then set about freeing Tony, then Paul. They stood, intending to run, but collapsed as their legs were numbed from being tied up for too long. Their bags contained some ointment, but they had no idea where the bags were now. The three men helped each other move silently between the stilt houses, carefully avoiding making any noise as they exited the village. All three had been wounded by arrows during their capture, and their bodies were smeared with blood. They pressed on, enduring the pain in their quest for survival, finally making it out of the village and into the forest. Paul whispered, "Don't take the same path. They'll find us. Let's go this way." The three turned right from the village gate, not knowing where the path would lead. When they heard the cry of a jungle fowl, they realized dawn was near. "Hurry, it's almost morning. If they realize we've escaped, we're done for." The three hurried as fast as they could, and soon they reached a hill planted with maize and cassava. It turned out to be a cultivation area for the villagers. Though they had not gone far, they were already starving. They grabbed 3 ears of young corn and ate them ravenously, then continued moving. Instead of going into the forest, they snuck through the maize field, carefully erasing their footprints as they went. Back in the village, someone discovered that Vin and his group had escaped. A loud gong sounded, and the villagers quickly scattered in all directions to search for them. Meanwhile, in the maize field, Paul and Tony were in great pain from their arrow wounds, and the fingers bitten off by the dogs throbbed fiercely. Paul's head began to ache, and he seemed to be developing a fever. He said, "Let's rest for a bit. My wound seems to be getting worse. It hurts more the further we go." Tony nodded. His shoulder wound was also extremely painful. Vin, having the least severe injuries, felt the least pain. After they sat down, Vin checked Tony's wound. It had begun to fester and swell, showing signs of infection. Vin said, "Bear with it. I need to drain the pus out. If we don't, it'll get infected. After I drain it, I'll put some plant leaves on it to help." Ton 6 nodded, gritting his teeth. Vin pressed firmly on the wound on Tony's shoulder, and a stream of blood and pus flowed out. Tony winced in pain but bit his lip to keep from crying out. After a while, when the pus and blood were drained, he chewed some leaves and applied them to the wound, then tore a piece of cloth to bind Tony's shoulder. After finishing with the shoulder wound, Tony said, "Brother, check my lower back too. I think there's another wound there." Vin pulled up Tony's shirt and tugged his waistband down slightly. There was indeed another wound, larger than the one on his shoulder. This wound had also begun to fester, and the surrounding skin was scraped, possibly from running. It was so cold the night before that Tony hadn't felt it. Vin immediately began to treat this wound too, then wrapped it tightly to keep the leaves in place. After bandaging Tony, Vin turned to Paul. He removed the cloth covering Paul's hand. The wound was much worse. The dog bite was beginning to rot, emitting a foul odor with pus, blood, and some yellowish fluid oozing out. Vin said, "Try to endure the pain. I need to drain the pus, or your arm will have to be amputated. I hope the dog that bit you wasn't rabid." Tony squeezed Paul's hand tightly, and pus and foul-smelling blood spurted out. Paul nearly screamed in pain, but managed to stifle it. After draining the pus, Vin applied the leaves to Paul's wound and helped him secure it. Just as they were about to continue, they heard dogs barking and people shouting nearby. A hunting dog suddenly lunged into the maize field, and before they could run, they were discovered. A howl rang out, and Tony said, "Run, Brother Vin. Leave me, live a good life. Take care of my wife and 2 kids. Run quickly. You're not injured, you can escape. Leave me behind." Vin shouted back, "Are you crazy? We live or die together." Paul also spoke to Vin. "You're still strong. Run. We're both too injured to go far. If they catch all 3 of us, we're dead for sure. It's better for us to stay and let you escape. If I survive this dog bite, I might die of rabies anyway. Go quickly." Vin refused to leave, still trying to help Tony and Paul up, but both had decided to stay and not hold him back. The dog reached them and began barking loudly. The sound of many people running through the maize field created a huge commotion. Tony pushed Vin away, shouting, "Run, brother. Don't worry about us. Live a good life and never return to this place." In the distance, shadows of people were closing in. Vin still hesitated until Tony yelled, "If you don't run, then our deaths will be in vain." Hearing this, Vin embraced Tony and said, "I owe you a life." He turned and hugged Paul as well. In this moment of life and death, both were willing to sacrifice themselves for him. Vin turned and ran deep into the maize field, disappearing from view. The dog started to chase after him, but Paul quickly pounced on it, holding it down as it yelped. At that moment, the villagers arrived, beating Tony and Paul mercilessly before tying them up and carrying them back to the village. As for Vin, after he ran, he continued through the maize field, crossing a stream. Instead of heading into the forest, he followed the stream, wading along the flow downstream. Behind him, the sound of dogs barking and people shouting grew louder. He jumped into the water, hoping to mask his scent and throw off the dogs. He then continued running, falling, and getting scratched by branches. But he no longer felt the pain. The worst pain was the thought of leaving Tony and Paul behind. Vin didn't know how long he had been running. When he finally became exhausted and could no longer lift his legs, he stopped. Meanwhile, Tony and Paul, after being recaptured, were brought back to the village. The villagers took them to the river, washed them clean, and then led them to a large agarwood tree in the forest. Repeating their previous ritual, Ken used the blood of Vin and Paul to water the roots of the tree, which swayed its branches and leaves as if in delight. The bodies of the two men were then fed to a tiger, and their heads were placed on stakes near the tree. The number of stakes represented the number of people who had died there. During this ritual killing, a girl from the village, curious, had secretly followed from a distance. She was a kind-hearted girl, who normally wouldn't harm any creature in the forest. But today, after 18 years living there, she accidentally discovered the cruelty of the men in her village. She didn't tell anyone about what she had seen. From that day on, she viewed the people she once considered close with disgust and fear. She understood that everyone in the village probably knew what Ken was doing. But since he was the shaman, no one dared to speak against him. Thus, they lived under his oppressive rule and those of the warlike, cold-blooded men. As for Ken, he wasn't angry when Vin escaped. The previous night, while tying them up, he had cast a spell on them. In fact, every captive Ken had ever caught was cursed. He did this to prevent them from escaping. Unless they escaped capture in the first place, anyone he caught would be cursed. If the spirit was away from him for a month, it would destroy its host's body to break free. Therefore, Ken didn't worry much. AGARWOOD. Chapter She, Dream, Tony Son. After Vin escaped, it was unclear how many days he crossed forests and rivers before finally reaching the end of a stream, which opened up into a large river. Having traveled extensively before, Vin recognized the river and knew where he was. He quickly found a path leading to the main road and managed to get a ride back home. Then arrived home during a torrential rainstorm, looking gaunt and frail. When Mrs. Teresa saw her son return, she burst into tears. Vin's body was covered in wounds, his face was dark and worn, and his hair was wild like a man from the forest. Tony's wife, who had been feeling anxious lately, heard that Vin had returned and rushed over. She saw that Vin was indeed back and hurried into the house to ask him, "Brother, you're back. But where is my husband Tony?" Vin, his eyes filled with sorrow and dark circles from sleepless nights, looked at Tony's wife and sighed. "We were chased by the forest people, and we had to scatter and run in different directions. It was very difficult for me to get back here. I don't know which way Tony and his friend went. The forest people had tigers, so we didn't dare run together." Hearing this, Tony's wife suddenly burst into tears. "Oh, my dear, where are you? Come back to us. Vin, tell me, did something happen to my husband? Tell me the truth." Vin remained silent as Tony's wife cried desperately. Suddenly, while he was standing, blood gushed from Vin's mouth. It flowed continuously, red and black. Mrs. Teresa and Tony's wife screamed in panic, but Vin was already unconscious. They quickly rushed him to the hospital. After some tests, the hospital informed Mrs. Teresa, "The patient has a strange disease that we haven't identified yet. His lungs and most of his internal organs have been completely corroded, as if some creature is lurking inside his body." Vin was hospitalized for 2 days before being sent home. But in reality, he was sent home because he was as good as dead. He hadn't been able to eat or drink for the past 2 days. The doctors had to administer nutrients intravenously. After returning home, Vin grabbed Tony's wife's hand and said, "I'm sorry to you and the children. If I hadn't agreed to go on that trip, wouldn't be in this situation. I'm about to go too. Please forgive me. After I'm gone, please take care of my mother. Here is the money I have left. Use it to support your life." No sooner had he finished speaking than Vin coughed up another mouthful of blood and then closed his eyes for the last time. The two women hugged each other and cried like a storm. There is no pain greater than witnessing a loved one die before your eyes. The old burying the young. Vin's funeral was held on a day of pouring rain. Tin, Tony, Son had to carry the incense for Vin. The funeral procession struggled through the storm. After the funeral, Tony Y fell into despair. But with everyone's support, she slowly regained her composure. She still didn't know whether her husband was dead or alive. Vin, the only one who knew what happened to Tony, had already passed away. Time flew by, and 3 years passed. Tony's second child had grown up and was now running and playing everywhere. The lingering pain in Tony's wife's heart was the uncertainty of Tony's fate. 3 years had gone by without a trace. Had finished school and found a job near home, commuting daily to take care of his mother, his younger sibling, and also Mrs. Teresa. Since Vin's death, Mrs. Teresa had been frequently ill, but fortunately, her condition wasn't life-threatening. Lately, had been dreaming about Tony. He kept dreaming that Tony was dead. And in the dream, Tony would instruct, "Remember to take care of your mother and sister in my place. I'm sorry I left without a word. I'm sorry, my children. I have wronged you." This dream repeated night after night. Was deeply troubled by thoughts of his father, but didn't dare to speak up, fearing it would upset his mother. Finally, confided in a university friend now working in another province. His friend suggested he could help interpret the dream, asked his mother's permission to be away for a few days to visit his friend in Janique, Elasik. When he arrived, his friend Dong greeted him and said, "Rest at my place first, and then I'll take you to meet the shaman. He lives in a village not far from here." That afternoon, Don took to a nearby ethnic village, to a rather shabby stilt house. Don called out softly, "Elder Bro Kim, are you home? Elder Bro Kim?" A voice from inside the house responded softly, "Yes, I am here. Come up." Donan climbed up to the stilt house. A frail man was holding a pipe, exhaling thick white smoke. As soon as he saw, he put down his pipe, stared at it intently, and said, "I smell a very evil scent on you. Has someone in your family recently died?" Was astonished. He didn't understand how this man knew someone in his family had recently died. But he replied, "No, sir, no one in my family has died recently. My father disappeared 3 years ago, and my uncle also passed away 3 years ago." Upon hearing this, Brakim asked further, "That's strange. I can smell the scent of a poisonous herb on you. It's faint but definite. You must have come into contact with it. Yet, you say no one in your family has recently died. Very strange indeed. Anyway, let's set that aside. What brings you to see me?" Don quickly replied, "Elder Bro Kim, can you interpret my friend's dream?" Lately, he has been dreaming of his father returning. He told you the story earlier. His father disappeared 3 years ago, and we don't understand why he's suddenly having these dreams. Tell Elder Brokim about your story. Began to recount his father's story. How he went searching for a loose wood, and everything that had happened, including Vin's death and his recent dreams. After listening, Brokim took a long drag on his pipe and said, "I didn't expect things to turn out like this, like a joke. Do you know why I can sense the scent of poisonous herbs on you? It's because that herb belongs to an old enemy of mine. Let me guess how your uncle died. Did he die from having his internal organs completely corroded? And when they examined him, they couldn't find any specific disease, right? And before he died, he often coughed up blood, was shocked." Brokim's description matched exactly with Vin's condition before he died, as if Brokim had witnessed it himself. Nodded in agreement. Brokim took another drag on his pipe and said, "If I'm not mistaken, your father is dead. Your uncle died because of poison that corroded his organs, and your father was murdered. The one who killed him is someone I know. He's my adopted younger brother. Many years ago, he harmed people in my village and then disappeared. Later, I found out he had become a shaman in a village deep in the forest. I never thought, after so many years, I would see signs of him again. You stay here, have a meal with me, and I'll tell you the story about him and me." Brokim's eyes gazed out into the distance beyond the stilt house, looking lost in thought. More than 30 years ago, in a small village at the foot of Lynn Mountain, this was the first village in the area, with no one knowing exactly when it was established. The village's founder was affectionately called Elder Bang. Elder Bang was the head of the village and had a biological son named Kim and an adopted son he found in the forest named Ken, who had just turned 20 that year. In this place, 20 years old was the age of maturity when one would live independently, have children, and be given a plot of land as a dowry. However, things took a turn when both Kim and Ken fell in love with the same girl. Nan, this pair of brothers, were both exceptionally good-looking and strong. In the village, Kim and Ken were considered the best warriors after every hunting trip. They both knew they loved Wainan, who was seen as the village's flower, with her smiling eyes, dimples, and long, flowing hair. Whenever she went out, a group of village boys would follow her, eager to help. Nan's heart, however, had already been given to Kim when Ken found out. He was furious and jealous, although he never expressed it openly. Every time he saw Kim and Nan together, he felt as if 100 fires were burning inside him. Elder Bang, now over 50, was still strong and clear-headed, but he no longer wanted to hold his position. He wanted to focus on small chores because, besides being the village head, Elder Bang also served as the village shaman. His charms and amulets were trusted by the villagers for their efficacy. He had been teaching his 2 sons, Kim and Ken, everything he knew, and they had absorbed about 80% of his knowledge. As for Kim and Nan's romance, Elder Bang planned to pass on his role as village head to one of his sons. He didn't reveal his plan, but silently observed them to see who was more talented, virtuous, and kind-hearted toward the villagers. He didn't care whether it was his biological son or his adopted son. However, recently, Ken unable to win over the girl he loved, began harboring resentment. He secretly learned how to create a powerful love charm, using what he had learned from Elder Bang. Finally, Ken managed to create a new type of love charm that would make anyone under its influence fall madly in love with only one person until death. Even if the charm was broken, the person would go insane. Ken found a way to approach Nan to cast the love charm on her. During a village festival, while everyone was dancing and feasting, Ken managed to get close to Nan and cast the love charm on her. A few days after the festival, the charm took effect. Nan no longer cared for Kim. She always avoided him. Now, her heart was only filled with thoughts of Ken. After winning Nan's love, Ken was overjoyed, unaware that Elder Bang had discovered everything he had done. Elder Bang never imagined that what he had taught Ken would be used to harm people. Determined not to let this slide, one night, Elder Bang called Ken into his house and said, "You cast a love charm on Nan, didn't you? I know everything. She didn't love you, so why did you do it? She loves your brother. I never thought you would become such a wicked person." Ken argued back. "But Elder, I love Nain. No one can take her from me. Kim is my brother. He should yield to me." Elder Bang angrily slammed the table and said, "HMPH, stubborn despite being wrong. Did I teach you to behave like this? Charms and arbs are for saving people, not harming them. If you don't break the charm, I will tell everyone in the village." Ken stood up defiantly and shouted, "Go ahead, tell them. I love Nan, and no one can take her from me, not even Kim." Saying that, Ken stormed out. Elder Bang sat inside, shaking his head in disbelief. He'd never imagined that Ken would become like this because of a girl. Elder Bang's threats were only meant to scare Ken, but he didn't expect Ken to hold a grudge against him. Elder Bang tried to break the love charm on Nan, thinking that all of Ken's knowledge came from him. However, he didn't anticipate that once he broke the charm, Nan would go mad. Kim, after losing Nan, drowned his sorrows in alcohol. When Ken discovered Nan had gone insane, he knew someone had broken his charm. The only person in the village capable of breaking it was Elder Bang. Enraged, Ken confronted Elder Bang, and they had a heated argument, which Kim overheard. Infuriated by Ken's despicable actions, Kim followed him after he left Elder Bang's house. The two brothers fought fiercely, but Ken was at a disadvantage and fled into the forest, disappearing without a trace. Kim and Elder Bang tried everything to cure Nan, but they didn't realize that the charm Ken had created was beyond their understanding, beyond even Elder Bang's knowledge. They planned to wait for Ken to return and force him to lift the curse on Nan, but they never expected him to disappear into the forest, never to be seen again. Nan continued to wander the village, laughing and crying hysterically, occasionally tearing off her clothes and running into the forest. Kim, still caring for her, followed her to protect her from other young men in the village who might take advantage of her. Gradually, the village learned about Ken's treacherous deeds and began to despise him. They hoped he would never return. One time, someone spotted Ken in the forest, and the entire village chased him away. Since then, he hadn't been seen again. 2 years passed. Elder Bang was about to hand over the role of village head to Kim, who was set to become the youngest village head ever. They thought peace would last forever, but they didn't expect that one early morning after their festival different from the kin people's Lunar New Year, several children went missing from the village. Early that morning, the villagers rushed to Kim's house for help. They searched everywhere but couldn't find any trace of the children, as if they had vanished into thin air. Not far from the village, in a cave hidden deep within the dense forest, Ken was sitting inside. In front of him were 3 children he had just kidnapped from the village. Over the past 2 years, Ken had been elsewhere, learning how to make deadly poisons, and now he had returned for revenge. He had given the 3 children a herbal concoction to put them into a deep sleep. Then, Ken took out a black herb he had cultivated. With a flower that had a mesmerizing blend of red and black colors, Ken poured out a bag of soil he had prepared, enriched with various herbal ingredients to nourish the plant. He formed a small mound in the center, planted the herb in the middle, and then covered it with soil. After planting, Ken pricked his fingertip and dripped 15 drops of blood onto the flower, muttering, "In 2 days, I will give you a feast." He kept the 3 children alive by feeding them ginseng water. 2 days later, while the children were still unconscious from the herbal concoction, Ken dug 3 holes beside the herb and buried the children alive, leaving only their heads above the ground, clustered around the iyabe's roots. Before burying them, he had cut their wrists, letting the blood seep into the soil to nourish the herb. The herb absorbed the blood, and its black leaves gradually turned red. Ken hid in the cave for 3 months and 10 days. The flower on the herb turned bright red, from the stem to the leaves. He dug up the herb, but as soon as it was uprooted, it withered. Beneath it, the roots had split into 3 tendrils that pierced into the 3 heads of the buried children. He used a knife to sever the rotten heads, pulling up the herb roots with them. Then he used the knife to split the skulls, revealing a wriggling mass of maggots and a foul stench filling the cave. Ken, instead of being repulsed, was overjoyed. He sifted through the slimy remains inside the skulls and found more than 10 maggots, fat and white, wriggling among the herb roots. Ken picked out all the maggots and eventually found over 10 that were jet black. These were the ones that had absorbed the poison from the herb, turning their bodies black. These maggots could be used directly as a deadly charm, or simply dipped into any water source. Anyone who drank that water would die instantly. Looking at the black maggots in his hand, Ken laughed maniacally. "Ha ha ha, I've finally succeeded. Kim, Elderbang, you wait for me. I'm back, and you better be ready for my wrath. Ha ha ha, all of you must die, every single one of you." The eerie laughter of Ken echoed from the cave into the forest night. The animals around the cave, startled by his laughter, screeched and fled to find shelter elsewhere. Chapter 12. A Night of Slaughter. After cultivating the poisonous maggots, Ken called them poisonous alusewood. He packed them all into a black glass jar, sealing it with a pure Eloisewood stopper. Strangely, the maggots became unusually excited when they smelled the alusewood from the stopper, but Ken had no idea why. He didn't leave the cave immediately. Instead, he waited until nightfall to sneak into Kim's village. Since the disappearance of the 3 children, The village had been on high alert. Some said that a tiger spirit had come out of the forest and taken the children, while others believed the gods had taken them away. 3 months passed with no sign of the children, and the villagers took turns patrolling the village at night. In the beginning, they were eager and determined, hoping to catch the intruder as a great achievement. But as 3 months went by without any incidents, their vigilance waned. That night, Ken crept through the forest, moving stealthily like a tiger stalking its prey. He took a path leading to the back of the village. Having lived there for 20 years, he knew every nook and cranny well. In the darkness, Ken moved like a ghost. He made his way to the water tank, a communal water source in the mountains, where water was piped down from the forest through bamboo tubes into a large cement tank for the whole village to use. Ken approached the water tank cautiously, checking his surroundings to ensure no one was watching. Then, he took out one of the poisonous maggots. As soon as it was removed from the glass jar, it began writhing violently. Ken dipped it into the water, and with the faint moonlight reflecting off the surface, he saw a black substance spreading from the maggot's body into the water. Once it stopped writhing, Ken quickly put it back into the jar and whispered to himself, "You drove me away, did you? Now I'll make you all die. All of you, die." After speaking, he detached the bamboo pipe that carried water from the forest to the tank, preventing fresh water from washing away the poison that the maggot had released. Once he was sure everything was in order and there was no evidence left behind, Ken turned and left. As usual, early in the morning, the villagers went to the water tank to fetch water for their daily activities. This custom had been practiced for many years. The village was bustling with the energy of a new day. But suddenly, cries erupted from several stilt houses. "Oh God, help! Someone, please help my family. Help!" That night, Elder Bang left his house alone and went into the forest. In the forest, he moved swiftly and silently like a forest spirit. Everywhere he went, he left a trace of white powder, colorless, odorless, and undetectable to humans and the leaves. This powder was meant to track traces. Although undetectable to humans, certain herbs and plants would consume the powder and reveal anyone who had been in contact with it. If anyone entered the village with traces of the powder, the plants would detect them immediately. After setting the traps, Elder Bang returned home. The survivors of the village gathered at a house near Kim's to support each other. The water source was thoroughly checked by Elder Bang before use. For 3 days straight, Elder Kim closely monitored the plants to detect any trace of Ken, but he did not appear. That night, outside the village, Ken stood at a distance, his eyes filled with hatred. He ground his teeth. "Elder Bang, Kim, as long as you're alive, I won't be at peace. I want to see how you die." Ken was confident in his poisonous alusewood and believed no one could detect his poisoning of the water source. This time, he took the same path into the village to poison the water tank again. But as soon as he entered the village's perimeter, Elder Bang sensed his presence. He called to Kim. "Kim, there's an intruder in the village. Take everyone to check it out. I'll circle around the forest edge to cut off his escape route." Elder Bang handed a plan to Kim and, holding his machete, ran into the forest. As Kim and the others arrived, they caught Ken just as he was reaching into the water tank. Kim shouted, "Ken, I caught you. I never thought you'd be so heartless. The people of this village have treated you well since you were a child, and yet you turned on them. You're worse than an animal." Ken was just as surprised. He had been very cautious when entering the village, yet he was still discovered. Realizing there was no point in hiding anymore, he laughed and said, "Ha, you found me quickly. Yes, I did it. What can you do to me? Soon, it will be your turn too. No one can stop me. Ha ha." With that, Ken turned and ran toward the forest. Kim shouted, "Stop, stop right there." Kim yelled as he chased after Ken, and the others followed closely behind. Kim took a crossbow and aimed at Ken. But it was as if Ken had eyes in the back of his head. He dodged every arrow just before it struck him. One man ran, and 10 others chased him, their shouts echoing through the forest. In the distance, Elder Bang heard the commotion and knew that the person harming the villagers had appeared. He ran quickly towards the direction of the shouts and recognized the figure running as Ken. Elder Bang then took a different path to intercept him. He knew every corner of the forest like the back of his hand. Ken kept taunting his pursuers, unaware that Elder Bang had blocked his way. As soon as Ken saw Elder Bang, he was startled. His eyes lowered. Unable to face Elder Bang, he tried to change direction to escape into the forest. But no matter how he turned, Elder Bang was there to cut him off. Finally, realizing he could not escape, Ken stopped and said, "Move aside, old man, or don't blame me for being ruthless. I abandoned the gratitude of 20 years when I left this village." Kim and the others arrived, surrounding Ken and Elder Bang. Elder Bang spoke. "Did you poison the water and kill the villagers?" Ken laughed loudly, Yes, it was me. All of you deserve to die. Only then can I be at peace. Elderbang shook his head and said, You're more like a demon than a human now. 20 years ago. Chapter 13. Bro Kim is injured. After Kim ran into the forest and disappeared, those who stayed behind carried Elderbang's body back to the village. As for Kim, after running into the forest, his face was covered in tears and filled with immense hatred. He followed the trail of blood left on the leaves, chasing Ken, but even after running far from the village, he couldn't find any trace of him. Wandering aimlessly in the forest, Kim almost lost his way. Luckily, with his experience in the forest, he managed to find a path back to the village. But as he was making his way back, suddenly, Ken was standing in front of him, seemingly waiting. Upon seeing his enemy again, Kim shouted, You dog, today I must kill you to avenge my elder. You should be torn apart by tigers and leopards. Kim threw his crossbow to the ground and, with bare hands, lunged at Ken. Though Ken was injured, he was still agile and strong. The two grappled, attacking each other with the most savage and brutal blows, like tigers fighting for territory. It was unclear how long they fought, but the sky began to darken. They were still entangled, neither willing to let go. Ken seemed to be losing strength. Kim pressed a knee against his throat. Gasping, Ken said, Let me go. I swear I will never return to the village again. Killing Elderbang was my mistake. Please, let me go. Hearing this, as if killing someone was just a trivial matter to him, Kim grew even angrier. He pressed Ken down harder and said, You are worse than a beast. It's best to kill you. You've already taken so many lives. Neither was willing to yield. Neither had the strength to finish the other. After a while, Ken suddenly managed to overturn the situation, throwing Kim off him. Quickly, he grabbed a handful of dirt and threw it straight into Kim's face. Blinded by the dirt, Kim staggered back. Ken seized a broken branch nearby and struck Kim hard on the head, shouting, Die, go and die with your father. Ha ha ha, no one can kill me. Kim fell to the ground, a stream of dark red blood flowing from his head onto the ground. Ken then left, and the forest fell eerily silent again. Darkness gradually engulfed the area, with Kim lying there. It's unknown how much time passed before Kim regained consciousness. Some crows had perched on nearby branches, cawing loudly. It was already morning, and his head pounded like a hammer. He tried to sit up, but dizzy, he kept collapsing back down. After several attempts, he finally managed to stand. Using a branch as a crutch, his stomach growled with hunger. Slowly, he made his way back toward the village, stopping frequently to rest and eating wild fruit when he was too hungry. By evening, Kim finally returned home. The villagers, who had been waiting for him, split up to search when they didn't see him return. They found Kim struggling to walk back, injured. Elderbang's body had been placed on a large pile of wood, awaiting Kim's return for cremation. When Kim returned to the village, he learned that he had been unconscious in the forest for an entire day and night. Fortunately, he hadn't encountered any wild animals. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made it back alive. Upon his return, Kim personally lit the torch to cremate Elder Bang's body. In their custom, the village elder's remains were cremated, and the bones were kept in the communal house. After Elder Bang's death, Kim was filled with despair and sorrow. Soon after, he left the village to wander. Several years later, he arrived in Kuklok, where he found a village plagued by an epidemic. Using what he had learned, Kim stayed to help treat the villagers. He later met and married a woman from the village, but sadly, their time together was short. They had no children, and she passed away from illness. Since then, Kim had lived alone. After fighting Kim, Ken thought Kim had died, but he was surprised to learn that he had survived. Ken then fled deep into the forest, eventually ending up in this village. Through his cruelty, he gradually gained control of the village, wanting to dominate it and use the villagers as his pawns. And Don sat and listened as Elder Kim recounted his painful past. They couldn't believe that over a trivial matter, Ken could mercilessly kill almost everyone in his village. After finishing his story, Elder Kim looked at it and said, "That's why I said there is the scent of Ken poisonous Aluswit on you. I'm certain he is still alive and harming others in his quest to research his evil charms." Not knowing Elder Kim's intentions, asked, "So, Elder, do you know the way to that place? I want to find my father. If he's dead, I need to see his body. If he's alive, I need to find him." After hearing this, Elder Kim leaned on his cane and stood up. He walked to an old cupboard and pulled out a hand-drawn map. Unfolding it for and Don to see, he then said, "This is a rough map drawn years ago by a survivor from my old village. He once saw Ken deep in the forest. I don't know if that path still exists now. I have a request. If you want to go there, take me with you. The debt between him and me needs to be settled. It might be fate that brought us together. If you're determined to find your father, let me go with you. To be honest, what has always weighed on my mind is letting Ken roam free like this." Don and were unsure whether to refuse or agree. Elder Kim continued, "If you want to enter the forest, you need someone familiar with the terrain to guide you. And if you want to find your father, you'll need to learn some skills to protect yourself. I'm not the best, but I have plenty of experience. If you want to learn, stay here for a few months, and then we'll set out." In the end, agreed to go with Elder Kim. He stayed to learn some martial arts and a bit about charms from him, as if being trained as an apprentice. Don also found it interesting and decided to stay as well, setting aside their jobs. Time flew by, and 6 months later, and Don, once thin and frail, were now strong and agile thanks to regular training and a healthy diet. With their newly acquired self-defense skills, Don and Elder Kim left Kim's home in Jani-Kelasek to return to Kontam, ready to embark on a new journey. Chapter 14. Akim's Return. Akin's Death. Conclusion. After arriving in Kuntum, the first thing did was bid farewell to his mother, and Mrs. Mahay didn't dare tell them he was going to search for his father. Instead, he lied, saying he was going to the south to earn money to support his mother's efforts to raise his younger sibling, explaining that there was no money to be made here. Leaving home, the three of them headed to Kumplong district, Elder Kim led them back to what was once his village. The place had developed into a new village. It had been 30 years since his last visit. Now that he had returned, everything seemed so different. Memories from the past flooded back as Elder Kim stood gazing at the large communal house in the middle of the village, the place where the villagers used to gather. It was still standing, though worn with the passage of time. The three of them wandered around the old village, and suddenly someone shouted, "Kim, is that you? Are you Kim?" Startled, Kim looked up to see an elderly man with a cane, hobbling along the cemented path. Recognizing the man, Kim embraced him. He was one of the survivors from 30 years ago and still lived in the village. As they released each other, the old man shouted loudly, "Everyone, come and see. Our village elder has returned. The village elder is back." His voice echoed throughout the village, drawing many people out of their homes. Kim saw that they were strangers, members of the younger generation. A few elderly people appeared, and when they saw Kim, they rushed over. Some even crying out loudly, "The village elder has returned. Come see, everyone, our village elder is back." The whole village gathered outside the gate. Many were seeing Kim for the first time and found him unfamiliar, but they recognized him as their elder, because a picture of Kim hung in the communal house. After Kim left, the village had no elder. Those who remained lived together and gradually rebuilt the village. But they never forgot their village elder. Kim, as time passed, they continued to revere him. Kim explained why he had returned. After listening, no one opposed him. A tiger roaring would frighten all creatures. Perhaps for 30 years, Kim had been a lame tiger, but now he had returned as the true king of the jungle. Some villagers wanted to join him, but Elder Kim refused. Taking Oni and Down, the three of them entered the forest. Following the path Kim had taken years ago while pursuing Ken, the person who drew the map back then, had long since returned to dust. The three carried their belongings on their backs, never letting go of their machetes. Kim also carried his old crossbow, recently retrieved from his former village. Relying on his experience and a familiar scent, the scent of Ken poisonous or loosewood, which also carried on his body chem, tracked the path. He hadn't expected the scent to linger for so long. They moved slowly, resting along the way. Over half a month later, they reached an area of the forest untouched by human footsteps. Kim pulled out the map, scanning the surroundings to see if they matched the drawing. But everything had changed too much over the years to find their way to the village. Kim waited for nightfall and brought out a milky white herb, plant that Elder Bang had used years ago to track Ken. This herb could detect other herbs over a wide range. Kim released it, its white form standing out in the darkness. The herb floated away, leaving a scent for Kim to follow. They followed it throughout the night. The next morning, they rested until noon and then continued. The herb traveled far, and Kim followed the scent it left behind. A week later, the three found the first human footprints. Kim, looking at Andone, said joyfully, "This must be where Ken has been hiding all these years. We've finally found him. Now, we must be cautious going in. We are few, and if he discovers us, it could be deadly. He then took out 2 pieces of herbs and handed them to Andone, saying, "These herbs I've prepared will dispel poisonous miasma, ward off dangerous insects in the forest, and repel tigers. I've heard Khan has a tiger, so we must be careful. He's very skilled in charms and herbs, so we must remain vigilant." The girl replied, "There's nothing left. The bones were eaten by a tiger. I advise you to leave quickly. If Ken finds out, you'll all be dead. She'll follow this path. When it ends, turn right and you'll reach it. That's where our village's sacred relic is." The girl left. Don wanted to stop her, fearing she might be lying. But Kim shook his head and said, "Let her go. I've already placed a tracking herb on her. If anything happens, we'll know. Let's find a place to hide. We'll act tonight." The 3 of them slipped back into the forest, waiting until nightfall to move out, following the path the girl had shown them in the morning. They reached the village's sacred alusuwood tree. As they approached and examined it, Kim exclaimed, "HMPH. I never thought the sacred relic the girl mentioned was this wicked thing." Curious, Andon asked. And Kim explained, turned to leave, but stopped her and asked, "Can you show me where my father was killed?" The girl pointed to the path they were standing on and said, "On the outside. It's an alusewood tree, but inside. It's a nest of poisonous herbs. Ken kills those who stumble upon this place to water the poisonous herbs with their blood. If these hives aren't nourished with human blood, they will die. Look here. The base of the tree is stained black with the blood that has been spilled here. There are even bones. These are human bones. I must destroy this illusible tree, or Ken will use it to harm others. This time, I must kill him. Saying this, Kim took out a bottle of gasoline from his bag and poured it around the base of the elusive tree. Just as he was about to light it, a tiger's roar echoed. Ah, Wong. Ah, Wong. Startled, the three realized that in their focus, they hadn't noticed the tiger approaching. The roar carried far, alerting Kim, who shouted, "There's an intruder in the village." Ken quickly ran out of his house. Meanwhile, Kim, unafraid of the tiger, calmly